So I'll just explain the structure of the talk then. So I'm going to explain the background to this piece of research, then the objectives, what we were trying to achieve, how we went about it, and what actually happened. So we were trying to find out, how does the glass move? Where does the information come from? What do the spirits say about God, the spirit world and reincarnation? And come up with some sort of demographic analysis from the information received. And then have a look at any conclusions which we were able to come to or not able to come to. Okay, so the background, first of all, a small group of us, that is members of ASSAP and CPSG, Chesterfield Psychic Study Group, got together to try and experimentally research the table tilting phenomenon. And we did this for a number of months, but apart from some slight movement on one occasion, we couldn't actually get it to work. I found out somewhat later that I think we'd gone about it the wrong way. Apparently the thing to do is to do it in complete darkness and not worry to start with about whether anyone's cheating or not. But we actually did it with a red light, and maybe that's why we couldn't really get it to work. But having come to the conclusion that we weren't really getting anywhere, we decided to take a step down and try the Ouija method instead to see if that offered any potential for research. So it was, in fact, easier to get results. We thought they might have given us some advice on how to get the table tilting working. That didn't happen. So we stuck with the Ouija method. There's information available on the web about the basics, the history and the sale of Ouija boards, but there seems to be a dearth of literature on researching how the phenomenon works. So the objectives then, we were trying to understand how the glass moved, trying to find out where the information we got came from, to get the views of the communicators on spiritual matters, and to analyse the chronology, geography and other characteristics of the communicators. A number of you might be thinking, well, this is quite a dangerous phenomenon, because it's fairly well known that a lot of people have tried the Ouija and found that it gives problems. For example, when I was in my 20s, a friend of mine described how when he was a teenager, that he had a go at using the Ouija with some friends. And they said, can you give us a message? Which is not what you do, but that's what they did. And the message they got was death. And they said, when's this going to happen? And it said 7 days. And they said, who does this information refer to? And it spelt out my friend's initials. So then, as you can imagine, he was scared stiff that he was going to die a week later, even though he was only a teenager. In fact, a week later, his father died. And his father had the same initials as my friend. So in fact, the information was correct precognitively, but in the meantime, it had scared him silly, and he was determined not to use this method again. So that's the sort of thing that can happen if you go about it in the wrong way. Another example is given in Michael Bentine's book, The Door Marks Summer. I'm sure you'll all know that Michael Bentine used to be the president of ASSAP. And he describes in the book how a publican friend of his used the Ouija to get a winning horse in a horse race. And it won, and he won some money. And he thought, oh, this is good. So he did it again, got another winning horse, won some more money. And kept on doing it because the information was always correct. But he became so reliant on this method and he always consulted it before making any decisions. So eventually, he literally went out of his mind. He never used his own mind to make decisions. He always consulted the Ouija, and the Ouija communicator made the decisions for him. And because he went out of his mind, he ended up in a mental hospital. So again, that is a word of warning, a word of caution as to what not to do. However, we took a number of precautions to avoid these problems, and I'll describe presently the precautions that we took. In the meantime, I'll describe how we did it. So I've never actually seen a real Ouija board, but I've seen them on television, and they seem to be fairly compact, designed for 2 people. We really wanted this to be a bit more of a group activity. So we used the tumbler and alphabet method, which is essentially the same. So this is a makeshift Ouija board. So we use lettered cards, as you can see on the slide there, from a Can You Go game, distributed around the edge of the board, and used a glass, a spirit's glass, of course, inverted, upon which we pressed our touched our fingers, and hoped that the glass would move around to spell out the information. So there were, in fact, 4 of us around the table. There were extra cards indicating yes, no, goodbye, and don't know. And a 5th person sat at a separate table, acting as the scribe. So as we got messages spelt out, so we'd call out the letters and he would write them down so that we could work out what the messages were, and so that we had a record of what had happened. The actual composition of the team involved in the research changed slightly over time. I and former ASSAP member Mike Rush were involved throughout, and several others were involved for part of the 3-year period that we did these experiments. So we met at my house once a month over 3 years to do these experiments. The other people who were involved for part of the time were CPSG members Ernie and Betty Maycock, Clive Ellis, Debbie Martindale, John Lavender and Brian Royce Dexter, and also ASSAP members Simon, Philip and Nicola Royce Dexter. So obviously we wanted to avoid the problems that I mentioned. I've even heard on the odd occasion of someone using the Ouija method and it being followed up with poltergeist activity in the house. So what did we do to avoid these problems? We ensured that everyone who participated had the right motivation in mind. That is to say, to be seriously trying to understand more about the workings of the Ouija and related phenomena. So we had that in our minds. We're doing this as a serious piece of psychical research, and we only involved people who were particular about doing it for that particular reason. We articulated out loud at the beginning of each experiment the purpose of the seance, what we wanted to happen and what we didn't want to happen. And this was usually done in the form of a prayer. With each communicator, we used closed questions to start with. So we might ask, for example, are you a woman? Or did you live in England? Well, these sorts of closed questions obviously only can produce the yes and no answers. They don't give any scope for getting strange or scary messages. And if we were getting sensible answers, then we would open it out a bit, but to very specific open questions. Like, for example, can you tell us your name? Or can you tell us your address when you lived on the earth? Again, no scope really for getting any information other than what we actually wanted. It was only once we got a rapport going with the communicator that we'd open it out even more. And even then, we would be careful about how we worded things. So, for example, we might say, do you have a helpful message for us? The emphasis there is on the word helpful. And we avoided asking questions about our personal futures. We didn't want to get information that we didn't want to know. After the first 3 experimental seances, it became clear that it was worth devising a sort of script of standard questions to be asked of each communicator, as it was found to be difficult to quickly devise sensible questions on the fly when momentum had built up. So if you've got going with a communicator, you don't want to suddenly run out of questions and it all falls flat. You want to make the most of that opportunity for communication. So the script queried such matters as the gender and name of the communicator, together with the time period and location of his or her life, etc. Okay, so what actually happened during these sessions? At the first seance, it took 50 minutes before the glass started moving. At subsequent seances, the glass moved sooner and sooner, and by the end of the research period, it typically took just a few seconds before it started to move. I suppose it's like with so many things in life, practice makes perfect. At the first 2 seances, the combinations of letters spelled out were largely nonsensical, but as the research continued, the communications generally became more and more articulate. We can draw a parallel here, I think, with what happens with automatic writing mediums, because when they first start experimenting with that, they typically start getting scribblings to start with, and then gradually that turns into meaningful communications. After we worked through the standard script with each communicator, on a number of occasions, we'd proceed to concentrate on attempting to throw light on a specific aspect of this research via particular tests or questions. So at certain seances, for example, we attempted to research the mechanism of the glass movement. When asked, the communicators indicated that they moved the glass by controlling the finger and not the mind of one particular sitter, giving Simon as an example. This hypothesis was tested empirically and found to be true by placing different combinations of sitters' fingers on the glass. For example, when only the fingers of me or John or Nicola were on the glass, no movement occurred. So it became clear that the fingers of certain persons could be used to produce a movement, but not the fingers of other people. So we proved experimentally that if Simon or Debbie or Betty had his or her finger on the glass, regardless of what other fingers were there, we could get the glass to move. But if none of them had their fingers on the glass, and just some of the rest of us, the glass didn't move. So we concluded that you do need what you might call a Ouija medium for this phenomenon to work. We had a communicator once called Daniel. When asked, he stated that he used Simon's finger to move the glass. So having worked out who the mediums were we did an experiment where Simon was the only person with a finger on the glass who was a medium, right? The rest of the fingers belonged to those of us that weren't mediums. So we knew if any movement took place, it would be through Simon. So we blindfolded him. And when he was blindfolded, we still got sensible answers, but with more spelling mistakes. When asked how communicators knew which house to come to communicate via this method, the typical response would be, "You called, I came." An experiment was attempted to obtain movement of the glass with no fingers in contact with it. If that had worked, we would of course have had psychokinesis. However, that produced no movement. We had a communicator called Mark who stated that he could still see the letters when Simon was blindfolded, but that it was more difficult to spell. So these people seemed to be able to see what was on the table and direct Simon's finger, but found it more difficult when they couldn't use his eyesight. At one seance, I consciously, mentally tried to influence the glass to spell out Kevin when one communicator was asked his name. However, the name Billy was spelled out, implying that the thoughts in our conscious minds didn't lie behind the information conveyed. We did experiments in which a particular experimenter would write down a question hidden from the other experimenters and then concentrate on it. The intention being to see whether the controlling intelligence of the glass movement could telepathically pick up the question and answer it. However, these attempts were unsuccessful, the answers being unrelated to the questions. So, in other words, the communicators were unable to get information telepathically from us. On some other occasions, we homed in on exploring the nature of time. Communicators indicated that time existed in the spirit world, but not in the measurable way that it does on Earth. They said there weren't any clocks or calendars there. We had a communicator called Muxar, who, when asked whose finger he's controlling, moved the glass to Simon. We asked a communicator called Olive whether she knew where we were, and she knew we were in Derbyshire. So we tried to see if communicators could foretell significant world events. And some communicators declined to do so. But and these experiments, by the way, took place between 2002 and 2005. In August 2003, a communicator called Kathy offered America, sorrow and upset. We could perhaps interpret that as being a reference to the Hurricane Katrina disaster of August 2005. However, we must admit that the message is rather vague. Could really have referred to any bad incident, and a more specifically worded prediction would be needed to provide concrete evidence of precognition via our Ouija experiments. The aspect of this research which potentially offered most scope for testing hypotheses was the source of the information conveyed. So we came up with all the hypotheses which might explain this. So was somebody consciously pushing the glass? Was the glass being moved by somebody's unconscious mind, unconsciously pushing it? Was the information coming via super ESP? Was it coming from bona fide spirits? That is to say, the spirits they claim to be. And the spirits usually seem genuine, but it's difficult to get objective proof of that. Or was it what we might call incognito spirits? Spirits that were spirits, but not the spirits they claim to be. On one occasion, we experimented with one or other of the known mediums deliberately moving the glass to spell out a word, even when the rest of us were not aware of the word being spelled. Words were still successfully spelled. However, to achieve this, it was noticed that the glass swiveled in a different manner from that occurring during the seances. So the movement was distinctly different when a medium was deliberately trying to move it than when we were getting actual communications. And both the mediums involved reported the need to apply much more force to the glass than they would during a seance. Such observations, together with our personal knowledge of the extent to which the mediums took the whole subject of psychical research seriously, made the possibility of deliberate, that is fraudulent, movement of the glass unlikely. So was the information coming from the unconscious minds of the sitters? Various surnames, names of roads, pieces of historical information were communicated of which we had no prior knowledge. For example, at one seance, a Sarah Board came through claiming to have lived in the Shetlands. That's B-O-R-D was spelled out, Sarah B-O-R-D. None of us had ever heard of the name Board, but follow-up research on the web revealed that Board was a name used in the Shetlands for a plank or board, that it had other meanings in Gaelic, that it is used as a surname even today, that a Sarah Board had died in America, and that there had been at least 2 people by the name of Board in the Shetlands. At other seances, addresses previously unknown to the communicators were given. For example, now I'm going to make reference to specific communications. Those of you, if anybody's following this on a smartphone, I guess the printing might be too small to see, but I will describe the pertinent aspects of what happened. So we had a communication from somebody called Jay Porter, and she said she lived at 3 Norton Terrace, Huddersfield. And none of us had ever heard of such an address, but when we had a look afterwards, we found such an address did exist. Another example was that a communicator called June Bagshaw said she lived at 42 Kirkdale, which we assumed she meant Kirkdale Road, Oldham. Again, we hadn't heard of that address, but subsequent research found that there is a Kirkdale Drive in Oldham. And somebody gave a road beginning with Royal Park in Leeds. Again, we hadn't heard of that, but it did exist. And so it was with names. For example, with this communication, we have a Clarissa Belk coming through. None of us had ever heard of the surname Belk. Yet subsequently we found out that there was such a surname. And another name that came through was Prest. So we have a William Prest here. saying that he was that he lived at Tyneside, but wasn't originally from there. We hadn't heard of a surname Prest or any connection with Tyneside. But we found, yes, the name does exist, and we found 2 Prests in Tyneside. Now, this chap, William Prest, said that he was with the 1st Dragoons and that he was stationed in India in 1904, and the British Army were fighting the Indians at the time. And he said he was shot in battle with them. Well, of course, we knew that Britain had battles with the Indians in the early 20th century, but we did not know specifically that the 1st Royal Dragoons were there in 1904 fighting. Yet we found from the regimental records subsequently that the 1st Royal Dragoons were in 1904 in India, in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh. So his account that that's where he was, and that he was shot in battle with Indians in India in 1904 sort of makes sense. Although we will come back to this a bit later. But the point is that we didn't know any of this information, and only follow-up research found it was right. Whereas if the information had been coming from the unconscious mind of one of us, then that would indicate that the second hypothesis could have been correct.
Just about, wait a minute, I've got a Zoom meeting on. No, it's all right, mate, wait a minute, I'm gonna, yeah, it's playing up, don't mate, I've got to mute myself, hang on.
I think somebody needs to mute himself. At one seance, a communicator by the name of Claude, or as he claimed to be German, presumably Clauder, claimed to have been the German captain of a ship. So I asked him several questions in German, to which sensible answers were received, despite the fact that the only mediums in contact with the glass were Simon and Debbie. And Simon had no knowledge of German, and Debbie had insufficient knowledge of the language to understand some of the questions I was asking. So the fact that we got sensible answers to those German questions again implies that the explanation for this is not unconscious pushing. Okay, what about super ESP? So we've got the idea of a sort of cosmic database, possibly, rather than individual spirits coming through. Yes, something to consider. So as an example here of our questioning, we asked a communicator called Muxar whether he'd be willing to try to move the glass with no fingers on it. And his reply was, why? And when we asked a communicator called Kathy, who claimed to have died as an old lady, was asked how old she looked to other people in the spirit world, her reply was, how old would you like me to look? I guess implying that spirit people can make themselves look like whatever they want to. If super ESP consisted of a mechanistic process of psychically accessing a cosmic database of all information ever to have been amassed by living people, we would imagine that either the database would provide an answer to the question or an acknowledgement that the answer is not known. The concept of answering a question with another question, especially a rhetorical one, as per my last example, doesn't seem to fit with the idea of a mechanistic process. It's the sort of thing that a person would do. Another indication that super-ESP was not the explanation was the incorporation of humor into some of the communications. For example, when a spirit called Adam indicated that he designed wings for flying machines, and Mike asked what the flying machines were used for, he replied, flying. And when asked what the cause of his passing was, he replied, dead. Similarly, a facetious remark by Simon, resulting from the habit of Olive of addressing different sitters with the endearments dear and love, produced a response of stop moaning. And a later comment from Simon, as a result of the particularly strong rapport that built up between this communicator and the sitters, that he would like to take Olive home with him, produced a response of, well, you can't, so there. Humour is surely a characteristic of the human personality, thus implying that a personality was more likely to be behind the communications than a mere mechanistic process. So you can see that we tried various experiments and tests and questions to try and narrow this down. And all that was left really was the idea that it really was spirits, which they claimed to be, that were communicating. Many of these spirits helpfully provided personal details which offered the opportunity of post-seance research using demographic records. And I'm grateful for the help of Simon and John with that. Typically, the initial research using genealogical websites and street maps would indicate that someone of the given name could have lived at the relevant period in time and that such an address existed. An example is James Tufnell of 32 St. George's Road, Hull, who came through in September 2005, claiming to have died in 1906. And we did find in the genealogical records that chap of that name, of that address, who did die in that year. But this was the exception. Another example was that on one occasion, an auntie of Debbie's came through, Debbie's mother, Vera, and made reference to the youngest grandson, Thomas. And the communication between Debbie and the person claimed to be her mother led Debbie to conclude it really was her mother that was communicating. That was really the only personal communication we had. We weren't specifically looking for personal communications. This was trying to be a piece of research after all. But most of the time, when we looked up the genealogical records, we could not pin these people down. So, for example, if we go back to William Prest, we found a couple of people of that name living in Tyneside who were not born there and about the right age for a soldier in 1904, although it gives different occupations. When on a visit to London, I did visit the Public Records Office at Kew while I was there. I looked up the regimental description books of the 1st Dragoons up to 1857, Much of the content was indecipherable owing to the restricted quality of microfilming, but there was no mention of William Prest. However, the regimental description books for the later period, when he was more likely to have been in the army, don't exist. I also looked at the casualty book of the 1st Dragoons, which went from 1850 to 1910. So that does include the period when he claimed to have died, but there's no mention of a William Prest, which is a bit odd, as he claimed to have died in 1904. So you can see we've got pieces of a jigsaw here that don't quite fit. If we have a look at a J. Porter, she said she was born in 1921 and lived at 3 Norton Terrace, Huddersfield, prior to her death in 1983 or 84. But when we looked up various sources of information, we couldn't find anyone of that name. Or a similar name that fitted Huddersfield. We had a June Bagshaw come through. She said she was born in 1910 or 11 and lived at 42 Kirkdale something Oldham prior to her death in 1989. Well, the address existed, but we could find no trace of a Bagshaw in Oldham on ancestry.com or mytrees.com. The nearest match was a Joan Bagshaw. Date of birth is different, and the city where she died is different. And the International Genealogical Index makes no mention of a June Bagshaw. So you can see the problem we had in trying to pin these people down. So we have here communication from a Clarissa Belk, who claimed to have lived at Riverside Farm, Newark in Nottinghamshire prior to her death in 1901. We found 3 Clarissa Belks in Nottinghamshire in the 19th century. A Riverside Road existed, but no trace of a Riverside Farm. But it's possible the farm was no longer existed, or it's changed its name or its role. We did find a Riverside Guest House and a Riverside Kennel or Cattery. But the 1901 census makes no mention of a Clarissa Belk. There was a Mary C. Belk, and the C could have stood for Clarissa, but she was in Gloucestershire, not Newark. It's possible that she died earlier in 1901. She may have been inaccurate about the date of death. So we looked at the 1891 census. Again, we couldn't find a Clarissa Belk, but found a Frances C. Belk. And again, the C could have been Clarissa, but she lived in Yorkshire, not Nottinghamshire. And the register of deaths included the name Belk, but none who died in 1901. So this was like kind of quite puzzling to us, really. So why, for example, did J. Porter apparently helpfully volunteer all the information asked of her, including her occupation as an Anglican nun, her views on the inaccuracy of the Bible in relation to what she found in the spirit world to be like, her year of birth, her age at death, and her final address, when the electoral registers showed her not to have been resident at that address? Why was this detailed information coming through for which there was no verification? It was very puzzling. Invariably, the communicators came across as being genuine, well-meaning personalities. As an indication of this, when asked for a helpful, constructive message, the typical response would be something along the lines of, keep smiling, or Simon, trust in yourself. However, were the information to have come from the spirits that communicators claim to be, we would have thought that their personal details would have matched those in the demographic records, which most of the time wasn't the case, as you can see. So why wasn't it the case? Well, maybe some communicators were incognito spirits pretending to be different spirits. Maybe they were bona fide spirits who were too confused in their afterlife state to be able to accurately memorize such details as their year of death or exact address. Or that maybe that the personalities had incarnated more than once and had confused details of one life with those of another, maybe given a name from one previous incarnation, but an address of another previous incarnation. That last explanation was given in trance when Simon's spirit guide, Adam, was asked about these anomalies. And I'll briefly mention about Simon's trance later. The use of a standard script, together with retention of the transcripts of the seances, enable various analyses of the background of communicators to be produced. Of course, all the analyses are only meaningful if the communicators are actually the spirits of the deceased and are providing truthful information. The communicators, but on that assumption, the communicators were roughly equally split between male and female. The geographic of the communicators' claimed Earth lives is shown in that slide in the pie chart, where local is arbitrarily defined as Yorkshire, Derbyshire, or Nottinghamshire, as that's the area surrounding around where I live. And the seances are all at my house. So where I live is kind of where Yorkshire, Derbyshire, and Nottinghamshire all come close together, more or less. So we've got in the mauve 3 communicators that, using that arbitrary definition, were local. A lot, 35 communicators who claim to have lived in England. Another 5 who claim to have lived in other parts of the UK. And the pale blue section, 5 who lived in the rest of Europe, and 3 in the dark section who claim to have come from the rest of the world. In terms of a chronologic analysis, we had a look at when their claimed years of death were. It'll be seen that the majority of communicators claim to be the spirits of people who lived in the 20th century. So we've got 6 communicators in the mauve section who claim to have lived before 1800, 8 in the maroon section who lived in the 19th century, the yellow section, 15 communicators who claim to have lived in and died in the first half of the 20th century, and the pale blue section, 10 people who claim to have died since 1950, so in the second half of the 20th century. So most of the communicators then claim to have lived in the 20th century. How did they die? This is how it broke down. So violence, that's the mauve section, we counted as being somebody being murdered or dying in battle. Medical, which is this pale yellow section, being premature death through illness or in childbirth. We're not claiming any mathematical accuracy here because all deaths commonly ascribed to old age are actually due to a medical condition. And so in some cases, it would be a matter of opinion on the part of a communicator as to whether his death was perceived to be due to old age or due to illness. However, as only 32% of the communicators specified that they had died of old age, and as something in the order of 70% of people in developed countries died over the age of 65 during the early 1990s, it can be observed by way of a generalization that a far higher proportion of communicators who came through during these Ouija seances died prematurely than one would expect in a random population sample, even allowing for higher mortality rates amongst younger people in years gone by. So we've got here 4 people in the maroon section claiming to have died as a result of an accident, 11 people who said they died with a medical condition, and these appear to be people who died under 65, and 10 people who died of old age. So a disproportionately large proportion of people who died prematurely then. Okay, so whilst gaining the communicator's views on spiritual matters was not strictly a research task, as there was no way of corroborating the results, it was nevertheless felt to be worthwhile for general interest purposes. In summary, all communicators asked claimed that reincarnation did take place and that the nature of God and the spirit world was rather more aligned to the general understanding of these matters within spiritualism than to the teachings of Orthodox religion. So they said in the spirit world, you don't need to sleep. People have specific tasks to do, that they usually communicate telepathically, that they can move objects with their minds or their bodies. So these would be their etheric bodies, of course. And they don't come into contact with unpleasant people, implying there are different spheres or dimensions for nasty people and normal people. Mike, perhaps rather naively, asked whether God was a person, and the answer was that God isn't a person as such. So thereby implying more, as per the spiritualist understanding, that God is a power rather than a person, and that God did not create the earth, which of course is the scientific understanding. Scientifically speaking, no doubt the earth was created the same way as all the other planets in the universe. Okay, so our experiments then, looking at how the glass moved, where the information came from, we were trying to do all of that as a scientific piece of research. This latter sort of information was more for general interest. While we were in contact with these communicators, as we thought it was just sensible to get information from them on these subjects. So in terms of conclusions then, we concluded that the Ouija really is a psychic phenomenon, because we did tests that provided evidence that conscious movement of the glass and unconscious movement of the glass weren't taking place. We concluded that only certain people have the ability to act as a Ouija medium, and that the communicators are probably the spirits of the deceased, but whilst appearing to be benign, are not necessarily those that they claim to be. We concluded from the information given that the majority of the communicating spirits died in the 20th century, lived in England, and died prematurely. Now, partway through this 3-year series of experiments, we found that Simon was going into trance halfway through the seances. So everything I talked about relates to the Ouija communications, not the trance. And the trance is beyond the scope of this talk. And basically, the spirits coming through in trance were either the spirit guide of the medium, Simon, who was called Adam, or more usually, what appeared to be earthbound spirits. And as things developed, the circle became effectively a rescue circle or spirit counseling circle. And we couldn't see any research possibilities with that, unlike with the Ouija. And eventually it became all trance. Communication we had was that the Ouija method was rather laborious. They wanted to use trance. And by the time it had become completely spirit rescue or spirit counseling circle, I was no longer particularly interested because it was no longer a research circle. And so I dropped out of the circle at that point. So that's what we did. So if anyone's got questions, I'll try and answer them.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk on Ouija boards.